And welcome on in, everybody, to the Check Your Brain podcast here, wherever you are listening to this for free, wherever you get your podcasts on Apple Podcast or Spotify for now, until Spotify figures this out and doesn't want me to be a part of this, or on Patreon at patreon.com/Tony Mazur. Go check that out. My name is Tony Mazur. I'm the host of the Check Your Brain podcast. And with me is somebody I've admired from afar. I've listened to him on other podcasts and seen videos and love his work, love what he's doing and putting himself out there. And that's Jensen. And I'm so happy to be talking to him because he has a new, it's a series coming out, and it's called Follow the Science. And it's essentially, that's what it is this follow the science mantra that we have now heard the last 3 years, that you can't question science. Science is concrete, even though we all know it's not concrete. We all should have realized, what was it, number one or number two in the scientific method was a hypothesis. And your hypothesis, things could be subject to change, but we decided, nope, science is settled. The science in all capital letters. And so I'm pleased to talk to Hawk, who's going to put a spotlight on what happened the last couple of years, and especially in 2020 and 2021 with Follow the Science, talking about this situation, the immediate impact and the downstream impact of the lockdown. So Hawk, thanks for joining us, being a part of the show here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So my first question, I got to start with a quick soliloquy before I lead it, but it'll lead into the question, is I would say this is about April 10th of 2020. My gym was closed. Your gym was closed. Everybody listening, their gym was closed. Their churches were closed. A lot of their places of business and whether they're working or that they frequent were closed. The liquor stores were open. So were the grocery stores, which happen to be big places of where people were getting sick, but couldn't do anything. So I don't have a Bowflex. I don't have a big setup to work out at home. So I would go for runs and it would clear my mind. I was getting angry over things. This was, again, April 10th, 15 days to flatten the curve. Now we're 10 days past the 15 days. So it's now 25 days of flattening the curve. And I'm wondering what is going on. And I would listen to Tom Woods' podcast, Michael Malice, Dave Smith, and I would get done. And I was running so long that I finished all the podcasts in my queue. So now it's just me and my breath. Me and my thoughts. And I'm in a development not far from where I'm recording this podcast right now. And I thought to myself, how is this era that we are currently going through going to be remembered? Who is going to write the history books? Is it going to be McGraw-Hill, where a child's textbook is going to say Dr. Fauci was John the Baptist, that he was Paul Revere, that he saved countless lives because of lockdown measures and vaccines and this, and this. And I thought to myself, because even sensible people, my friends, were saying, we got to get together for a Zoom happy hour. Like, I'm 32 at the time. I'm 32. You're 32. Statistically showing, I think we're going to be okay if we got together and had a couple of drinks and talked. Nope, got to do Zoom happy hour. Sensible people in the arts community, which I want to get to your thoughts on this because of being a filmmaker and me doing stand-up and me working in media. I was very disappointed in their reaction towards this. So I thought about, how are we going to remember this? Who is going to write this in real time? Who is going to document this? Where the people that caused mass death, that caused a lot of deaths of despair because of lockdowns, are going to be remembered as holier than thou people. And those of us who wanted a business open because we just want to go to Fuddruckers and just eat a sandwich and MAGA, this, and this. And I'm thinking, who is going to document this and be the person to say, no, that's your narrative. That's not the correct narrative. And when I found out Jensen, of all people, seems to be one of the first people to really put this out on the line, put his career on the line, and say, hey, I'm going to make this series about the impact of the lockdowns. And I was so happy to hear that. So I guess long-winded soliloquy monologue that I have here, the question I have is, was there a specific time for you that you said, I need to be the person that has to document this if no one else is?
It's a good question. Well, it was, I'll give a little lead up and I'll tell you how it came to be. How I came to be helming this project. Again, thank you for having me. Really appreciate it. It's a wild time we've been living through these last couple of years. And I I mean, I've spent my career, last 10 years, working with dissidents and working with people who survived closed societies, authoritarian societies, and I saw that it was a needed, stories that are in the margins, in the shadows, that weren't being served. When I heard of COVID, and it seemed like the medical and all these dissidents I spoke to said everything that they dealt with will reinvent itself and reemerge someday. And it would probably be, there were a number of things to look for, and it did seem as if a medical tyrannical move would be the move, would be the prudent move, because it's hard to argue against it initially, because it's like, oh, we're helping everyone. So I was living in California at the time. I heard of COVID. There was maybe a day or two of like, there's some unknowns here, and everyone seems to be taking it very seriously. But I realized it was going to be a major realignment of society and a major power grab by the powers that be, by the state. It was clear, and yet I knew that because of the current status of the way people heard things and saw things, I mean, I'd been jumping up and down trying to like let people know we're slipping into the world of authoritarianism without even putting up a fight, and it seemed like nobody wanted to do it. So I wanted to take it on. So I initially was like, well, it's time for me to get out of California. I had set myself up to bug out after, within 30 days. I ended up staying for a time. I had some family there, wrote it out for a while, and got out January 2021. And got my business out, got myself out. Not sure I had a travel trailer. I was traveling around. It was just like, I want to keep freedom of movement a thing. I just want to just enjoy this country while everyone is being forced not to. I'd only been gone about 2 weeks when I got a phone call from my colleagues, filmmakers all, who gave me a call and said, hey, one of us is a Tom Woods fan, and Tom Woods had just said, "Hey, someone should make this show. Someone needs to take this on." And my colleague did a little soul searching that night. It's like, oh gosh, that's me, and I mean himself. And then he's like, well, and he called some of his best confidants, and I was one of them. And he calls me up and says, "Hey, I think you should direct this thing." And it was like, I mean, I've been training for this for my whole life, effectively, and I saw it coming. I could see through it from the get-go, and it was like, all right, let's do this. So in the middle of of moving myself, it came time to take on a project like this, and we had to talk about it very seriously, because I mean these are all my colleagues and co-producers and the vendors and co-creators I'm working with. I mean, they work in we all worked in Hollywood. I mean, I'd been doing controversial stuff, so I felt a little more comfortable doing something controversial. But I mean, cancel culture was getting huge, and if you spoke up against this stuff, people were really jumping on you. You could see the knives were out. Even you could see the way something would be said, and it would be exacerbated about things that you had to do, the risk. I mean, everyone thought there was a 1 in 5 chance of dying from this, like a 20% chance. It's 0.02% chance. I mean, much smaller percentages. And it seemed as if people were way, way, way out of line with the reality of it. And so we just decided to do it. But we also knew that we didn't want to be working for an organization. We didn't want to have something that would usurp our message here, because we had an independent way of thinking. We had a difference of opinion. We wanted to support scientists and medical professionals who had a difference of opinion, who we could see were trying to speak up, and we're getting crushed everywhere they would make the attempt. So we actually started raising funds. We let Tom know we were inspired by him. He was very gracious towards us and gave us our first $10,000 towards our first $300,000 raise. And we set about making the pilot. So we're releasing the pilot episode. It's what we call a speculative pilot. We've made it on our own, and we're going to go as far as we can with it in terms of distribution and whatnot. We can talk about that in a little bit. But we raised funds for about a year, and then got into production. Started off with an interview with Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, which was a great place to start. And this was still early, when he was relatively unknown. People were had heard a little bit about the Great Barrington Declaration, because Dr. Fauci and Francis Collins had put out, the word had come out on the emails that they were trying to quash them as fringe. And but we really wanted to have something that appeal to everybody, like a broad array of minds, diverse thinking. So we got Dr. David Katz, who's a chronic disease specialist, and is often he's often appears in the New York Times, and started to put together a really great cast of what we call a hybrid documentary, where we have talent, we have influencers, and we have actors doing cut pieces. So we wanted to put together something that was entertaining, cinematic, created a world where people could step in and talk about this, because everyone, the one thing we could tell is that no one wanted to talk about it.
Yes.
Like, it was like, if you talked about it in any way other than towing the line, you were bad news. So just to kind of sum up the initial answer to the question, I got the phone call from some friends, and all of our artist tingly sense and our rational, logical sense was going off hard, and we were like, we have to do this. This is what we do, and we were very early on. I mean, it felt like our careers really were on the line, and they still are technically, but obviously things have eased off a little bit because we're almost at peak absurdity with it. But the need to, as you said, tell the story. We wanted to make sure we captured a historically significant perspective on what happened, because it's just getting shoved aside by everybody else. Like, I hate that the revisionist sort of mainstream narrative. Well, they'll just push aside all the things they did. So that was the impetus of all of this.
So you mentioned being in California, and I happened to be in California the day of the first bout of the insanity was going on. So I was out there for a work event, and we flew out to San Diego. We're up in Carlsbad and Oceanside, and this was March 8th of 2020. And we went out there, we're at the airport, we get to San Diego airport. And the whole big thing at that time was, don't touch your face, wash your hands. That was it. It was like, hey, you don't want to get sick? Oh, that sounds sensible. I'm fine. Sure. Hand sanitizer, wash your hands, try not to touch your face. Kind of, we learned that as teenagers because you didn't want to get acne on your face. That was one of the big things.
Yeah.
Then fast forward a couple of days, not weeks, not months, not years, days. It turned into, what is going on? The airport that we were at that was packed 4 days earlier was a ghost town. Nobody wanted to fly anywhere. Nobody wanted to do anything. And knowing my coworkers, they went to Walt Disney Studios and whatever, they were doing something. I said, I'm going to peel off from my group. I'm going to go to a hockey game. I went to go see the Kings and Senators at then known as Staples Center. I went to go to see Soul Asylum and Local H at a concert venue. And I went over to the Comedy Store. And my coworkers called me and said, do you think this is a good idea to be in front of crowds right now? And I said, I've read up on authoritarian governments and tyrannical governments and what they're capable of doing. I'm going to have my fun tonight, because I don't know when the next time I'm going to have this kind of fun. And truth be told, didn't realize how really way ahead of myself that I was, because I wasn't having that kind of fun for another 15 months at least.
Yeah.
That's just what happened. And then the insanity really started, and just seeing how people, and I think one of the big things is when you get into the topic of lockdowns, which is what this is about, is I think people really underestimated the lockdowns at the beginning, and they almost cheered it on because it seemed like a vacation. It seemed like, I've been so go, go, go. We had Christmas and birthdays and this and that. And I'm fine with staying home for 15 days. It's 15 days to flatten the curve. Fine. Look at this. I got more in my paycheck because I didn't go to the bar or the restaurant, and I didn't do this. I didn't drive a lot. So you made more money. And that's how it kind of hypnotized a lot of people into feeling that lockdown seemed like a good thing. Also, it helps prevent the spread. And I kept scratching my head saying, at some point, are people going to wake up? And unfortunately, a lot of people that, again, I thought were sensible people did not. And it facilitated, and it got even worse with the masking and the social distancing and the stickers on the floor when they started slowly reopening things, and 25% capacity at restaurants. A lot of restaurants can't operate at 100% capacity. What makes you think they can keep open at 25? So these are all the things that you're mentioning, and that the folks in the documentary are mentioning. But what I love is the attack on the lockdowns, because for a lot of people, they just assume that that's okay. You know, I'm fine with sacrificing my liberties as long as people don't get sick. And luckily, your series is coming out to say that's not how it is. That's not how it's supposed to be.
Yeah, it was a well-planned short-circuiting of people's good intentions. It was a well thought out. well understood that if people feel they have a righteous reason for doing what they're doing, as well as protecting themselves, protecting their own, protecting people who are also protecting themselves, therefore it's okay to roll back their own self-interest in terms of their liberties and freedom. And it's an obscure concept, freedom and liberty. What is it really? I mean, I've spent the last 10 years making documentaries about the concept, and it's hard to get it across to people what that means and what it is they're giving up. And we are also we are in this sort of me era with the internet, where the Google never says no to you, shall we say. People are always looking things up. They can instantly, they never have to say, hey, I don't know what that is. Can you explain that to me? That's not a thing people do anymore. People aren't confident enough to ask those sort of questions. And so the ability to ask questions and question the authority, let alone the source of the authority, became passe or verboten, really. And but you're right. It was very interesting to watch. It didn't matter. It did not matter the community. It could be, it was conservative, liberal, leftist, classical liberal, the local community college, theater groups. It just seemed to go right down the middle. Half would go one way, half would go the other. And I just saw the whole thing as, I remember when the masks started to come out, and they just don't, people don't even understand how the immune system works. You want to exercise your immune system. Yes. And so this idea of separating yourself from the world is actually not good for you. But that's the kind of thing that just wasn't common knowledge. There was just sort of this sense that if you're exposed to it, I remember like the weakest link. Those types of conversations were happening. And there was this incredible sense of, I'm doing it right, everyone else is doing wrong, and they're going to drop dead in the streets.
Yeah, I remembered one of my coworkers at the time asked me, and I think this had to have been May, maybe early June. So in Ohio, we didn't have a mask mandate until, I believe, July 4th weekend. And because it started, they say, if you're in a car with 2 or more people, whether it's ride share or you're with your family, got to wear a mask. I'm like, yeah, no police officer is going to enforce this. That's not going to happen. So it's probably late May, right before the riots started. And that's where I'm going to go to next.
Sure.
One of my coworkers said, how do you wash your masks? Like, do you hang them up? Do you wash them in the tub? Do you hand wash them? Do you put them in the laundry? And I didn't tell her. I said, oh, yeah, I have a bunch of them. That's all I said. But in reality, I never wore one to that point. There was no reason for me to wear one because I kind of figured really early on that the particles that emit from your mouth and your nose are way smaller than that little t-shirt sleeve that you put over your face for a little bit. It's not going to work even with an N95. A lot of us knew this when you want to talk about following the science, but they followed the propaganda science. And it was just really sad. And what was even more sad was how by the time we get to May, so we went from 15 days to flatten the curve to it's 2.5 months. People have indentations of their butt crack on their sofa because they've been sitting so long. They've watched Tiger King. They've watched everything on Hulu and Netflix at the time. They've ordered so much food on DoorDash that food just magically pops up. And all of our health directors and governors and leaders were saying, stay home, stay safe, wear your mask, can't go to the skate park, can't go to the playground, can't go to the beach. You'll have a Grim Reaper going up and down the beaches in Florida. Can't do that. You're killing people. Then George Floyd. And then we get to a weird point with the lockdowns where the same people who told us for 2.5 months that you need to stay home can't say that because then they're going to seem racially insensitive. So they're like, I guess racism is a bigger disease than COVID. So go out and make sure you wear a mask, but that's fine. And I think that woke a little bit more people up. Yeah, from the lockdown. That was a big epiphany moment. Like, was it truly about control or was it about controlling a virus? Because now you're telling us to go in groups of 10s and 20,000 people to go out and protest for something, which I'm all about. I'm fine. Protest. You do whatever you want. I'm a libertarian. But you just told us we can't go out, but now we can go out because it's an accepted form of protest. Did you see that when you were doing your research that a lot of people started scratching their head saying, wait a second, maybe the lockdowns aren't necessarily about stopping the spread?
That's a good example. The George Floyd riots were in the mainstream narrative of some things are just too important to worry about, respiratory diseases. I mean, that's when we were like, well, wait, that makes no sense. Here we are, we're doing our job. Because there was this initial point, kind of like in post 9/11. In terms of, I mean, you're a bit younger than I am, but in terms of, there was this, people were like, everyone was giving blood left and right in the days immediately after. There really is. I mean, I still believe in this country, and there is this sort of pulling together as an American when something big happens and people want to do something right. And it was being, that aspect of our sort of shared personality was, I feel, being exploited. But it seemed legit for a little bit, where people were like, well, we got to do what we need to do. And in like 2 weeks, there was a sort of this mission drift after the initial 2 weeks, and it was like 3 weeks, 4 weeks. But I personally was painfully aware that, I mean, it's well known, if you want to change, if you want to break a habit, it takes 30 days. If you want to start a new habit, it takes 90 days. I mean, all these kind of psychological things that are well known are also very well known to authoritarian regimes. And I could see as like, they've got their foot in the door. And I mean, a good example of this is like Ai Weiwei. Collectivist regimes, there's your cat. Collectivist regimes, authoritarian regimes know that, you don't want to give the mic, you don't want to give a platform or bullhorn to a dissident activist, artist, a free expressionist, and that what you don't want to do is put them on trial and let them speak, and it'll affect people, because ideas are like a virus to collectivists. Like someone thinking for themselves causes other people to think for themselves, and that's a bad thing. People will start questioning the authority. And so, like, if you may recall, Ai Weiwei was actually arrested and put in the jail for about 90 days, given no privacy, and forced to, he had 2 guards staring at him for those 90 days. Now, they know that basically the way it's understood is that once that happens, that artist will never fully express themselves as fully as they once did. It takes about that long. And I just saw this as one giant experiment to try and change the norms of how people acted, how people thought, and they just needed to stretch it out as long as they could. And like anything past 90 days is gravy. And they got this thing the last year and a half, 2 years, and it's hugely affecting. I mean, how do we account for the variable of the extreme stress of what was going on? You talked about people at the initial vacation in the laptop class, effectively, who really, in terms of the actual, the term privilege, that's a real privilege to be able to do that. Whether like, hey, stop working for 2 weeks, maybe work from home for 2 weeks and see how it goes. And usually the self-avowed left of center sort of liberal class, we're like, oh, this is great. And it's like, well, this is putting huge pressure on the people who live in poverty or not as well as means, or live paycheck to paycheck, who started to suffer enormously. And they just pretended those people didn't exist. I mean, 200 million kids went into food insecurity almost overnight. Hundreds of thousands are dying of poverty, famine all over the world. But it's just, that was out there. My bubble was okay. And it just turned everyone into these very self-centered, narcissistic kind of, what's the word? I'm trying to think what to call them. I mean, the NPCs kind of come to mind, yes, in terms of like that popular term, but it really was interesting to watch people, like, they were being changed by this effect, and disease, dis-ease. I mean, the old, if you break it down, stress causes symptoms. There's so many stressors coming in that, people are like, oh, I'm having all these problems. Like, I have my questions about long COVID. How do we know that being stuck at home, separated from people's family members are dying for all sorts of reasons? I mean, life was going on. I mean, people were dying from like kidney failure and cancer and all these things, but the hospitals didn't care. They just let them die at home. These are traumatic experiences. That's going to affect that larger family. It's going to affect everybody. And how do we account for that variable, and all those variables, and what it did to us? And it was like it didn't exist. It's like you couldn't even get it to register in their minds as something to consider, including the health professions. I mean, part of the docuseries, we have a couple whose father basically died due to medical negligence. He needed dialysis. He was dying. He had kidney failure, needed dialysis. He had tested positive with COVID, had no symptoms, but all they could do everywhere they went, they just like, oh, we have to treat him like it's for COVID. We're treating him like, no, they were desperate to get him dialysis, and they could not get anyone to listen. They absolved themselves of any responsibility for anything else. It became totally myopic, one thought, and it allowed people to think they were doing the right thing. And, I mean, it was, sort of a mass psychosis. We were watching it happen. And there were those of us who could see it And it's like you feel powerless in it. You feel powerless in the face of it. And so that's why we're making this docuseries. We wanted to be able to capture those of us who thought differently. And to your point earlier, I mean, there was a moment where it just clicked, like on a dime. Suddenly all the leaders said, we're all locking down, regardless of age, regardless of, you know, we really should have focused on who's vulnerable. Let's focused care. Who are the vulnerable? Let's create a system for them. We all support them. Society continues. That was the traditional, scientifically sound method of dealing with a pandemic. All that science was shoved out of the way, and sort of this build back better lockdown world kind of became the norm overnight for everyone. And you put it was like a 3 or 4 day thing. Poof, there it was.
Gone. And what was interesting was it just like after 9/11 that you brought up, was that we did have this feeling where normal people were getting together, you hug each other, you put your American flag out there. But in reality, the politicians, bipartisan, this is when the alarm bells should sound. They all got together, no matter what political persuasion, to say, we need to fight these terrorists. What do we get? We get the Patriot Act, where they spy on us. And it's like, wait a second, that's not what we were talking about. We're trying to say we need to snuff out terrorism. And instead, you're tapping our phones to make sure we're not saying anything a little uncouth. Well, what happened was in March of 2020, didn't matter if you're Democrat or Republican, they all failed us. My governor was the first in Ohio, Mike DeWine, who is a rhino, we call Republican in name only. He's a very pro-business guy, but he also thought he can reach across the aisle, be a little John McCain-like, and be a maverick, Mitt Romney, and say, we're going to start shutting. The first thing was, it was the Arnold Schwarzenegger Invitational. It was a bodybuilding competition that is in Columbus in early to mid-March every year. Shut that down, said, there's people from all over the place. We're going to close this. Then it became the schools. Then it became 9 o'clock. We're shutting down on March 15th. At 9 o'clock, the bars and restaurants shut down. The next day, March 16th, I'm on the treadmill. It's about 2:45. The governor spoke at 2 o'clock and said, we are shutting down immediately the salons and the gyms. And as I'm on the treadmill, I'm just starting. I was getting a good workout in, and I'm seeing the TVs being shut off left and right and going, here we are. Yeah. And I had to make sure in my mind, and to at least my small social circle, let's never pretend any of this that's going on is the new normal. Sure. All these very, in my opinion, Marxist, communist terminology that was popping up: new normal, social distancing, stay home, stay safe, wear your mask, wear this, and this. And it bothered me that everybody else just fell in line, like NPCs, like blue-pilled Americans. It's, online terminology, but
well, these arbitrary numbers in terms of like how many people get together, like 6 or 8 or I mean, it just seemed like there was a very concerted effort to stop freedom of assembly. What we have to stop is having people get together and exchanging ideas, because there might be a different way. I mean, because there were a lot of doctors, there were a lot of scientists who thought, oh, wow, this is happening. They sat down, they started looking at it, they started looking at the science, they started looking at what's going on. How do we best approach this? Lots of interesting things were coming out. People were issuing their own statements. I mean, medical professionals, but what to do, and all of that was ignored. I mean, it was just, what I think is about this country is we have all these petri dishes of experimentation and innovation. And it was like, and I was waiting for that Manhattan Project, Camp David Accord, in which we brought together the best minds. They devised the system of how do we test it? How do we create like the foolproof test for it? What it is, who's affected by it, who's going to volunteer to get the disease on purpose so they can test it. They can watch it purposefully, and who's going to be the volunteers to go in and be the control, like the control group. I mean, what happened to the control group? I mean, in science, that's a major part of it.
That was what was funny. You mentioned control. I'll get back to you in a second. It was funny how that they would just go with a mask mandate, and they'd say, well, this school it has lower cases because they have masks than this school. And you're like, there's no control here. Yeah. There's no control group. You're just putting out flawed manipulative data here.
And all these things, if you chose not to wear a mask, if you chose to interact, it was you deciding to take the risk for yourself. I mean, that was the thing that was interesting to me, that no one ever wanted, like the sort of the masses didn't want to believe that. I thought, no, you're putting everyone else at threat. It's like, no, you're putting yourself out there, so you get exposed, you allow your immune system to get to activate, and essentially, you know, if you're able to get it, beat it, get the antibodies for it, then your viral load will be very light, and you could actually help people by exposing them very lightly, if at all, you know, and like even asymptomatic transmission, which is not a thing really. I mean, but it was, again, the noble lie. Masks, asymptomatic transmission, those were all said, even by Dr. Fauci at certain points, those are not an issue for pandemics. Masks are not effective. But then the noble lie came along, and we're like, you know what, we're going to reverse ourselves, no matter how ridiculous it looks, because we want compliance. We want compliance, so we're going to start lying in their sense, in their own self-described noble sense of trying to get people to do what they say. And that's what I was kind of getting at in terms of changing behavior. They're looking for compliance. Yes. They want to know people do what they are told. This is their opportunity to turn the citizens of independent thinkers, critical thinkers of this country into one giant compliant collective.
We've all worked in businesses where somebody has a cold or the flu, and they're coming up, they're hacking, they're sneezing, whatever, and the boss has to come by and says, just go home today. You're not feeling well. So, I tried to come in, and if I could get through a couple more days, I don't want to take any sick time or PTO. And they're like, just go home. You're in effect. Yeah. I was fine with that at the beginning. Again, early March of 2020. If you're sick, stay home. Fine, that works for me. That companies will get together and say, look, there is a disease out there. Then it became healthy people. You may think you're healthy, right, but you may be infected with COVID and spread it to other people. So therefore, that leads to not only the lockdowns, because I might be sick right now, but I just don't realize it. I think I'm okay, but you're asymptomatic. So there was that, and the same with the masking. The reason why we had to have universal mask mandates, whether you're in remote areas or in densely populated, or densely populated areas, or heavily like New York City. Why does New York City have to have the same type of mandate that somewhere in like Waterton, New York, like way upstate, with populations of 5,000 in small cities? Why did that have to have a universal sweeping mandate over it? And it, like you said, it changed behavior. It changed a lot of people. And unfortunately, it changed people's perception when it came to politics, because even to me, this shouldn't have been a political thing. And I don't know if you guys mentioned that in the series, but it turned political. And I'm thinking to myself, I don't care who's enforcing this. This is wrong. I don't care if you're a Democrat or Republican. I don't care if you're Donald Trump, Joe Biden, Barack Obama, whether you have a blue state or a red state governor who's enforcing this. I think you're all wrong. But then it became such a political hot button issue because of the year that it was. It was 2020. So was there something when doing research for this project that you were seeing a lot of parallels politically, as opposed to, it wasn't just necessarily about the medical industrial complex, but you were also looking at a more of a political basis to this too?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the series, we really are focusing on the Institute of Science. I mean, how the Institute of Science got sort of elevated as the arbiters of truth, and we're trying to dismantle that. Science is this, it's an ongoing journey for truth that's constantly self-correcting and asking questions. In terms of the political aspect, we try to actually, we do discuss it. We try and actually not get mired in it. We try and look at like what science, what
science. So you mentioned the politics, but you don't get political.
Yes, we don't get, exactly, because we also know we want people to understand it. We want to create a scientific literacy in people who watch this. In terms of, I mean, as you know, language is under a lot of duress and control of definitions and stuff. So we try and establish terms, use them appropriately, use them in context, use them throughout the series, and so that way, if people watch this, they have a shared vernacular to then discuss what happened. We have some, I would say, deft ways to we bring up the politics at a certain point with people who have earned it, especially people who have experienced extreme trauma from this, and everyone experienced a degree of trauma from this experience. This is the first true worldwide experience. But I will say, in terms of the politics, in terms of the machinations of government and how it interacted with this, One of the things we did have to, we did a lot of discovery on was, we were collecting data. We have all these sources. We have we have these statisticians and various scientists supporting us. Nick Hudson is one of our co-hosts of it, and he's the chairman of Panda. It's Pandata and Analytics, panda.org. And they're based out of, they're a Southern Hemisphere European group of basically dissident scientists, doctors, and all kinds of professionals who push back against this. So they've been handing us all kinds of materials, and it's a lot of scientists who have a lot to say, who won't publish because it would ruin their careers.
Exactly.
But we have all this material and all these great sources. One of the things we learned about is like data collection. If you look at the United States alone, each state, let alone each county, has different ways of collecting data. And things don't exist from the perspective of the government until it's been reported to them. It's a strange thing where like you can have weeks of data, things happening. You can have trends of disease, trends of the virus, cases, deaths, if we're looking at COVID. And the government would say they could wait as long as they wanted to, like, okay, like the data can come in like every Friday, or they could come in like, please report it as it comes in. But some would like, we'll ask for it when we want it. And so they would say, okay, California, shall we say, or some other state, New York, and they say, like, send us the data from the last 3 weeks. Boom, all of it comes in, poof, there's a spike. All the cases, all the deaths, anything come in, and there's a spike. And then it's because that's not reality until it's been reported, they can point to it as if it's a spike in cases. And then that they could use it and say, oh, we're going to re-implement lockdowns. We're going to bring back mask mandates, whatever it was. Like, even though really those numbers were spread out over time, and there was no spike, or there were trends that were much more amenable to management, the government could, through selective timing of when they collected the data, to choose to make reality as they saw fit. And the variations on that theme from state to state to state could just manipulate that any way they wanted to. So like we use a lot of this data, and even we know like the data itself is questionable, but we're using conservative methodologies to look at what the trends were within it. And it was just that alone, seeing how the government had that much control over what reality was from their perception versus the experience of people on the ground.
And it really created, well, I don't want to say created, because I think a lot of the cable news from the first Gulf War, the second Gulf War started when you created the expert class. That this was the expert class. Like, you can't have a point counterpoint. You can't have crossfire. You can't have Paul Begala versus Pat Buchanan. You need to have one opinion because this is the expert. So it created during COVID that no, there is no Jay Bhattacharya. There is no Dr. Malone. There is no Dr. McCullough. We can't have anybody who's on this side. That's on the outside of the Overton window of acceptable discourse. So we have Dr. Fauci, who hasn't worn a lab coat in decades, but has to go on TV with his lab coat, or Dr. Birx or Dr. Walensky, and they have to lecture us on because they are the experts. And when you have an expert class, if you are somebody who disagrees with the expert, then you're just a peanut gallery. And that's what I love, the fact that you did get Dr. Jay Bhattacharya on here, because there were people in that Great Barrington Declaration that were sounding the alarm bells from the very beginning to say this disease is not impacting kids. If they get it, they get sick for a couple of days and then they're fine. And in fact, their immune systems are probably even better after that. It is affecting older people, obese people. And we knew this very early. This isn't something that just came out last week and we said, hey, because you start to see a couple of stories that pop up that say, their studies are saying that people who work out tend to live longer. You go, yeah, we kind of knew that. We kind of knew that a couple of years ago, but you were banned essentially from saying that on social media. So the expert class got to go in there and put their glasses down their nose. And if you disagreed with them, it's because you want grandma to die. And it bothered me so much that I would see, again, I'm going to say sensible people, or at least who I thought just fell in line. It was sad.
Yeah, killing grandma, that was a major meme of sorts, if you will, in terms of justifying all these, like, how dare you ask a question, you're killing grandma, and those things would kind of come and they would ebb and flow as they came along. It was shocking to see happen. And I mean, just even you talk about like the numbers. I mean, CNN, like here today's death toll. Where were those numbers coming from? There's no mechanism in the country to report cases and deaths at that rate, at that speed, at a daily effect. I mean, when someone dies, it's a long, arduous paperwork process. I've always that's one of those things you can ask any journalist. Where were those numbers coming from? There's no actual source for it. And then any numbers that went against them. I mean, this was what you talked about, Dr. McCullough and Dr. Malone, all these guys who were trying to raise the alarm about like, well, this doesn't make any sense because this is not how it's, we're ignoring all these aspects, all these measures that were perfectly fine yesterday, but now today, oh, we're going to ignore anything that goes against the narrative and goes goes against the expert class, as you're saying, and. It was just thinking about it a little bit. It was shocking to see. I mean, narrative is possible. I know what I'm going to say. I mean, this is what I often come back to, the power of story, because you talk about the Overton window, people only feel comfortable saying the thing they've heard somebody else that they believe has thought it through. They themselves don't think it through. They haven't critically thought through all the aspects of it. There's a presentation, they look good on TV, they're well-spoken, they say a certain thing, and then everyone says it over and over again. You turn on all the various news channels, they say it over and over again. And that there's something about the repetition that brings comfort to people, even though they could, the metaphorically, they're acting as a lemming and they're all heading towards the cliff. But as long as everyone's in lockstep and moving together in pattern, in rhythm, in regurgitating the same line, it somehow soothes people. And the authoritarian style consultants who I feel are highly influencing today's leaders this is what they're bringing to the table. And I do believe that because everyone's been exposed to it, I think there's a lot of people waking up to it like never before. People who, I mean, you're self-described libertarian, there's the freedom movement. I've been caucusing with the classical liberals for well on a decade and trying to defend freedom and freedom of expression. And it used to be, it just seemed to, we'd reach kind of the same choir over and over again. But I feel there are individuals, we were talking about the split up of all the different groups. There are people waking up all over the world who see what they're seeing versus what they're being told does not compute. And that is the awakening of the critical thinking. That's one click of of critical thinking awakening.
But on the other side, it causes that cognitive dissonance. Is that it's like, I was told one thing and you're telling me there's something else. No, you're wrong, because what I was told at the beginning is what I'm going by. And it's kind of like on Twitter, for example, when they post something that turns out to be fake and it gets 190,000 retweets and 750,000 likes. And then the correction has about 25 retweets and, maybe 50 likes. And you say, oh, okay, but people believe the first thing and they're told. And then when you present them that next bit of information by saying, hey, by the way, I know that's what you believe, but here are the actual facts. And they can't really process that. And like you said, this is all psychological, and people have really gone for a psychological journey during this time.
Well, and that's the power of story, because we have to use story to get knowledge across to people. You can't just tell them facts. They've been told a story. They have an emotional relationship to that story, and that's the whole idea of like the hero's journey. Why I believe cinema and why I believe a good story we're trying to get people to change their minds. So, cognitive dissonance means that's the resistance of that. I don't want to change my mind. They don't want to admit that. Yeah. But there is a process to change of what it is to go internally, consider something, and have it change your mind, have it click you to another space. You thought one way, and then you click to another way of thinking, and you have to cross thresholds. You have to have an emotional threshold that you experience. You go through it. You have this sense of achievement, and an emotion comes with that sense of achievement, that sense of triumph, pride, joy, elation, or fear, or even rage. I mean, the whole gamut. You can go through these thresholds, but at that moment of threshold, you learn one piece of knowledge that gets into your head. It's I don't know why. It's the player piano of our psyche. I don't know why we're wired this way, but this is the way that we're 100,000 years of oral storytelling. I mean, we've written words relatively new, couple millennia. All these video formats are only a couple hundred years old. We're not actually genetically predisposed to understand what's going on to us with this material. We just like oral storytelling. We absorb it. And there's something about the way emotions and knowledge interacts and how it passes along wisdom that we really have to have a counter, and we have to counter the mainstream narrative in order to reach people. And so in the docuseries, we actually have a what we call the Epiphany storyline. We have this lovely woman named Jen Reisman, who's being interviewed by the YouTuber Sydney Watson. And Jen Reisman is a child psychologist. And she was 100% bought in out of Maryland. I mean, she's like, I became the COVID police, where people weren't wearing the mask. Like, you got to do this. You'd see family on social media at birthday parties not wearing masks. Like, that's wrong. She could see it. But then she was also helping children at school who she could only see over Zoom. They were becoming miserable, depressed, suicidal ideation, abuse through the roof. Everything was going wrong, and she couldn't do anything about it. And she could see the lockdowns were having a worse effect on children, on families, on individuals in this country than the disease was having. And yet she could feel it. She could feel like, but I had to she was sort of an automaton enforcing the rules as she was told to, because that was the exchange. But then when they started pushing back further, like they kept not reopening the schools, and she saw her daughter becoming horribly depressed. The only thing they could do was walk the cat, because they had nothing else to do, because they lived in a little one bedroom kind of thing, or 2-bedroom apartment in Maryland. And she was desperate to keep her from hurting herself effectively. And it's one of those things where she was like, wait, this makes no sense. This makes no sense. And I started, and she'd explain, she like walks through, I started questioning myself. I started feeling these two parts of myself battling it out. And that's what we want to do with this story. Walk people through that, those different epiphanies, those different thresholds. We have certain emotions. And like when people, as you said, like when you show people things that go against what they believe to be correct, they're going to be like this. They're gonna be like, no, they're gonna hang. They want to hang the messenger for it. But if it comes from enough directions, and you see it over and over again, and we have high production value show to counter the mainstream narrative, my hope, the Soundmind Creative Group, who's my co-producing team with this, our hope is to change minds and lead people to an understanding, an epiphany of like, oh, maybe everything we were told wasn't what it seemed. And that's what Follow the Science, Lockdowns Go Viral is all about.
And you talk about the lockdowns, because for most people, the lockdowns in their area lasted about 3 months. I mean, like totally like you can't leave your house 3 months type. But then when we talk about, when some people say, well, I'm failing to understand what is still closed right now that you keep complaining about, I'm saying, well, I still see tape on tables. I still see to this day right now, plexiglass barricades on things. I mean, we're in February of 2023. This is 3 years we've been doing this.
There are people who are still barricaded in their homes.
Oh yeah, they still haven't left. I mean, anyone from Howard Stern to other people who are just they're afraid of leaving. They're afraid of germs. And the psychological impact, even though for some people they think, oh, it was just 3 months. It was a couple of, I worked from home. I made more money. I got my stimmy checks and everything like that, whatever they want to say. But the psychological impact of the schools being closed for a year, 2 years for some people, Zoom school, the truancy rates that were popping up, especially with Zoom school, and the kids who were going to whatever they wanted to call school, they were either learning about, ridiculous trans propaganda or Black Lives Matter, that kind of stuff, instead of reading, writing, and arithmetic. And others were just like, I don't need to go here. I'm just going to play video games because I got a chance to be at home. I read just today, that they were talking about the TikTok tics. I don't know if you've heard about this.
A little bit, yeah.
Kids, when they were going back to school, were having forms of Tourette's, I guess. And it's because their parents kept them in, either their parents or the government or whatever the case was, or the teachers, that you can't leave your house, you can't do anything, that when they started re-entering society, they couldn't handle that. So what are we doing to what have we done to the psyche of children? When you interrupt 3 school years, a kid who's in 2nd grade is going to be much different by the time he gets to 5th grade as far as development. The masking was huge too, because little kids pick up on social cues, especially from the face. And when everyone's faces are covered, they can't pick up on that. And so a lot of kids are 2 to 3 to 4 years behind of where their development could be. So that psychological impact is just, I mean, you can make a series about this till the end of time.
Oh, sure. Yeah. And that's what we were trying to establish. We want to establish the characters, the storylines, the world. The show is eventually, it's sort of a Cosmos meets Reading Rainbow. It's kind of like how I describe it, kind of with a wry sense of humor. Um, but I mean, tens of thousands of students have gone missing. I mean, I saw something like it's like 230,000 kids are just gone. They never made it to the Zoom transition. They just disappeared from the roles of school. They have not reappeared. I mean, I'm talking, people talk about epidemic. I mean, this is a travesty, and yet no one really wants to talk about it because it just goes against the way they feel about it. And I just think that's awful. I just think it's terrible. I feel like the American character has been under extreme duress, and I believe we have to step back up and become the responsible people, which means the ability to respond to these problems in a fair and safe way. And that starts with asking real questions. At the very beginning of this conversation, we talked about what it is to ask questions and what it is to ask questions of power and what's coming down and thinking, hey, that doesn't make sense. Maybe we should try something else. And we experienced this extreme shunning. I mean, shunning and shaming. I mean, those were old world techniques that we thought were left in the 19th century. I mean, we thought that we were done with that. And suddenly we're like, wow, we're experiencing shame and shunning for asking what we consider to be the right questions in the right time to try and figure out what to do. And so as an artist and my coworkers and colleagues, it's like, we need to support the scientists and the doctors who were asking the questions at the right time and
Right.
give them the platform and the ability to be heard, be understood, and push back. And I do hope that we find a path to dialogue. The whole point of the series is we have three hosts. We have Clifton Duncan, who's sort of the human interest storyline, Nick Hudson, who's the science communicator, and we have Sydney Watson, who tracks with the Epiphany story and the mainstream narrative. But we have those three different storylines because you need three different points to navigate. We're trying to understand, where are we now? So we thought these three different perspectives give us the ability for people to navigate what happened. But most importantly, at the end of the show, at the end of the pilot, the first episode, the three of them get together and have a conversation about what they each learned between their three perspectives. And we want to establish dialogue and conversation. And as we move through the series, we bring in heavier and heavier weights and continue that conversation, because conversation, good old-fashioned dialogue between people, where it's not just waiting for your turn to speak, but someone says something and inspires you to think. Your mind gets inspired. You think of something else. They say something, goes over. A bigger thing comes out of it, and we're gonna need that moving forward if we're going to figure this out together. And that's what the show inspires, and that's why we made the show. And so it's Follow the Science. Lockdowns Go Viral is the pilot episode. The premiere is April 19th. I'll throw this out really quickly. Is in Florida, in Orlando, with Tom Woods hosting, and Clifton Duncan will be there. And we're also, just a shout out to your audience, that we are raising funds to finish it. We've raised $450,000 so far. We're raising a final $50,000 to finish it up. We have all these amazing animations and special effects and VFX and publicity happening. So we're asking for donations at followthescienceseries.com. And we really hope that it's the kind of thing that if you want to have a conversation with your family or coworkers or people, you can watch this together, and it'll bring that dialogue back to the norm of how we come to understand things. So that's what Follow the Science is all about, and that's what I'm doing.
Followthescienceseries.com. You go there, check out the trailer there. It's about 2 minutes long. And and the last thing I have to ask you, and this has been a great conversation, is that getting a chance to have Clifton Duncan be a part of it. And I followed his story. You want to talk about following the science? Follow the actor here. He was a Broadway actor who finally had it, and that's what bothered me, and I'm sure it bothered you, was people in our businesses, like when doing stand up, and I was really upset by my fellow comedians that were encouraging people, actually discouraging them for going out on the road, for performing, for trying to earn a living. They're like, you don't need to go out there. You're going to kill grandma. It's a deadly pandemic, the deadliest pandemic in the history. You can't go anywhere. And I noticed that in the arts community, I thought, silly me, naive Tony here, thought that the arts community liked to be anti-establishment. They were the people that were speaking truth to power through their art, whether it is performance-based like stand-up comedy or acting, whether you're you're a drawer or a painter or graffiti artist. And it just seemed the arts community just knelt down to the government. They knelt down to Dr. Fauci, that Hollywood shut down and their productions and everything. And it really disappointed me. The people that you would claim that were speaking truth to power through their art were the ones chastising people for speaking truth to power through their art. And Clifton Duncan was a big part of that by saying, I'm not going to get vaccinated for something that people are getting sick regardless of vaccine status, and was essentially banished from Broadway because of his opinions. And I'm so happy to see somebody finally say, look, I can't be a part of this anymore. And he's found a new path. And I love that. And I'm sure you were probably disappointed by seeing a lot of your colleagues just fall lockstep in line with the government propaganda.
Yeah, it's I think we were coddled these last 10 to 15 years. I don't think we fully understand what the internet has done to us, to be perfectly frank.
Oh, yeah.
I think, there's a saying in sort of like in nursing homes where nurses, where if you work there, if you do something for someone, they'll lose the ability to do it. Like if there's an elderly person and they like cooking for them, like, oh, they'll lose the ability to do it. I think people really lost the ability to think for themselves. And I mean, I think the equivalent for young people is maps. No one reads maps anymore. They just know that they push something in their phone and then they just either follow the dot or they just get into the Uber and you materialize somewhere. They don't actually know the spatial relationships of where they are anymore, and they don't have that conceptual ability. They use it or lose it, and it just seemed to really make people truly self-centered and focused on themselves in a way because they feared acknowledging they didn't know. As I was saying before, they didn't have enough confidence to say, I don't know what that is. Can you please explain it to me? And they would rather go down swinging, sort of saying, no, it's all about me. I'd rather protect me. I mean, when you're saying that people are like, oh yeah, you shouldn't go on the road. It's like, no, they're not worried about you going on the road and killing grandma. They're just so terrified about themselves. They're scrounging for excuses to levy at you. They haven't thought that through. That's just a meme that came in. They've been told to regurgitate on you. And it's not them. They're worried about their own skin. It was true selfishness, and selfishness was made okay by all this. And I think trying to recapture selflessness and trying to what it is to work towards as an individual choosing to work towards a greater good is an entirely different thing than individuals being told to give up their individuality and comply because the state or some government or authoritarian entity wants you to comply regardless of the absurdity of it all. It's two different things. And it's just trying to navigate that difference is what I think we're all trying to do now. And I think, your podcast, your effort, your leadership and what you're doing and the messages you're putting out, what I'm doing and the messages I'm trying to put out through the show, and any real creative who they have to speak against it. I mean, I think a lot of artists, so-called self-proclaimed artists who kind of came up through the system through the last 10 years, they don't know what it is to suffer for their art. Everything's available to them online. They can just create stuff as if it's nothing. They didn't have to go dig it up and figure out how to do it for dirt cheap and with no resources. So I think Clifton actually just tweeted the other day about like anyone who calls himself an artist these days, as described what you just said, should probably reconsider the term because it's probably not the appropriate term for what they're doing. It's when you have to speak, you have to you think it, you see it, you think it, you say it, you have to say it out loud, regardless of the consequences. That's artistic expression, and that's what we need to get back to.
Follow thescienceseries.com. Those of us in our pro-freedom camp are going to watch this and just go, oh yeah, like this is great. This is fantastic. And maybe we'll also learn things that we even us didn't realize. But it's also for the people who claim to always be on the right side of history. And then they realize a lot of it, they were duped, they were lied to, they were propagandized in some of the worst, most evil, diabolical ways. That's the people who this series is going to hopefully impact, and we should reach out to them. Please donate to finish the documentary, and I'm going to donate as well. And I'm going to try to, I think I will be in attendance there, April 19th down in Orlando with Tom Woods, Clifton Duncan, and my guest today, which is Hawk Jensen from Follow the Science on the lockdowns and liberty and everything going in. This has been a fantastic conversation. I can't wait to put this out, and let's keep spreading the word. And just, even though what is it? May 11th is when Joe Biden said that the pandemic is going to be officially over. What's stopping him from doing it right now? Maybe he's
yeah.
waiting until the
All right,
premiere
everybody.
comes out of Follow the Science, and then he's like, okay, now the lockdown, now we're done with COVID. The pandemic is officially over because I finally got to wake up to this.
Yeah, well, my hope is that we're going to hit peak absurdity before that. I mean, peak absurdity is coming up soon, and I think everything's going to collapse under its own weight. That's my big hope for the future in general. But it's a wild world out there. But thank you to you and your listeners, and yeah, follow thescienceseries.com. And we actually have a sneak peek of a work cut on March 15th. So if anyone gets $20, they can be part of that. And we're actually going to have a survey and ask for feedback because we are trying to hone it to as a large of audience as possible. So there's also that screening coming up on March 15th, a sneak peek and something to give towards and a little reward for the effort. So thank you.
Yeah, forget beware the Ides of March. Prepare the Ides of March for that date. That's a great seminal time.
Yeah, and March 15th really feels like the anniversary of I think it was March 14th or 15th. That was the actual.
Yep.
I think that was when it all began.
March 11th was when we found out Tom Hanks had coronavirus, and then we needed to shut the world down because an actor got sick for a couple of days.
Yeah, sitting there in Australia, which really went full gulag.
Goodness gracious. Well, you have plenty of material for this ongoing series. Hawk, thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah,
can't wait to meet you in person. I'm going to donate to the fund. And please, again, go check out Follow the Science and followthescienceseries.com. Hawk Jensen, my guest today here on the Check Your Brain podcast with me, Tony Mazur. Thank you, everybody, for watching and supporting myself, my work, as well as Hawk's as well. Thank you, everybody, and we'll talk to you soon.